From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director, and today we're going to be talking about Syria, U.S. policy, and the potential impact of the upcoming U.S. elections. Thankfully, we've got two great guests on the program today to help us make sense of things. Charles Lister and Jomana Qaddour. Charles is a senior fellow and the director of the Syria and Countering Terrorism and Extremism programs at MEI. Jomana is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council with the Rafiq Hariri Center and Middle East programs, where she leads the Syria portfolio. She's also a doctoral student at Georgetown University Law Center and a member of the UN-facilitated Syrian Constitutional Committee. Charles, Jomana, thank you both for joining us today, and welcome to the program.
Thanks for having us.
Charles, to start off with, for our listeners who might not be following the situation as closely as the two of you are, can you briefly summarize where things stand in Syria right now?
Sure. I mean, obviously, a lot's happened over the last 9 years, but I think it goes without saying that that the Syrian regime has more or less consolidated control over roughly 60 to 65% of the country. Although the extent to which that control is enforced and is stable is obviously very much open to question. The south of the country, where quote unquote reconciliation was meant to have been most successful, appears to be sort of crumbling at the seams. There's an ISIS resurgence in the regime-controlled central desert. Idlib in the northwest of the country remains under opposition control and remains relatively unstable, continues to be targeted by regime artillery. In the northeast, there's a very complicated hodgepodge of US-backed Kurdish-led forces, regime forces, Iranian militias, the Russian military, and that continues to be a complicated operating environment for all of those actors. And of course, the Turkish military as well, of course. The Syrian economy is in crisis, and that's having a profound humanitarian effect on the population in all corners of the country, notwithstanding who's controlling those areas. COVID appears to be spiraling out of control, although testing capacities, whether we're looking at the opposition areas or SDF areas or the regime-controlled territories, the testing capacity is relatively minimal. So the numbers coming out look small, but by all means, reports from the ground seem to suggest that COVID is a significant health challenge. Of course, there are many other things happening, but I think the top line is that the crisis that we've all talked about since 2011 really is still there. It's just merely evolving. If anything, the sources of instability have become more complex, have probably risen in number. And that means that, looking forward, as I think we're going to discuss, the challenges are going to continue. And it's not just going to be a Syrian problem. It's going to continue to be a regional and an international one.
Jomana, as Charles mentioned, the humanitarian situation remains deeply worrying, especially with winter approaching and the spread of the coronavirus pandemic. What concerns you the most on that front?
Well, I think the most concerning part of the Syrian humanitarian issues is that none of them have ever been resolved, and they've only increased year by year. So picking up off of what Charles said regarding COVID, in the first several months, the spring and summer, we were very fortunate because there were very limited numbers, if any, coming out of northwest Syria, which, as you know, is home to about 4 million civilians in a very condensed area, with very little access to potable water, to proper healthcare, even to minimum hygiene, basic hygiene. And, unfortunately, our worst fears came true because now, in northwest Syria, you see an alarming number of COVID cases and very little that the population can do in terms of preventative measures. I think there are several humanitarian organizations, including mine, that have been, on the ground trying to preempt mass spreading, but there's only so much you can do in those circumstances. And then there's always the threat of more displacement in Idlib, and same in northeast Syria, because these two areas are still unstable in terms of control. We are always sort of holding our breaths for the next attack that may happen by any of the foreign countries involved. And last spring, we saw the largest displacement in Syria that we've ever seen to date. Didn't happen until last year, when 1 million people were displaced in 3 short months. So we're always worried about that exacerbating the already terrible winters we're seeing in the Middle East, the constant flooding that happens in those areas because there's no good sewage systems, et cetera. And a lot of these are, camps and very fragile tents that, wind alone could break, let alone snow and rainstorms.
Charles, as you referenced at the beginning, the security situation is another major concern. ISIS continues to ramp up its attacks, and violence is on the rise in areas like Daraa and Sweda. How do you assess the threat of ISIS in Syria at this point, and how do you see things developing going forward?
The first thing to say is ISIS is a shadow of what it was in years past. I think that is important to underline. But I think, when we've heard declarations from the US and other governments that ISIS was defeated in March 2019 when its territorial caliphate ceased to exist, those statements were sort of wildly both unrealistic and dangerous. Because there is, I think, a popular international perception that the ISIS threat, at least in Syria and Iraq, has kind of gone. And nothing could be further from the truth. Even in areas where the US military and its SDF partners are operating, the ISIS threat continues, albeit on a lesser intensity to the western side of the Euphrates River, where the regime is in control tacitly of a large expanse of mostly desert. And it's there that ISIS has really demonstrated a pretty worrying capacity for resurgence. It's operating across 5 provinces or 5 governorates, and it poses the kind of guerrilla or insurgent challenge that the Syrian military and its militia allies are simply incapable of dealing with. They don't have the kind of ISR and aerial surveillance that is able to both detect movements across unpopulated desert and then either deter or prevent attacks. And so what we've seen is relatively small ISIS cells travel across this vast expanse of desert and target both military targets, but also populated villages and towns almost at will. And at the same time, the Russian government has continued to claim that it has conducted alongside the Syrian military what it calls clearance operations. But because of those sort of operational challenges that I mentioned earlier, really what those clearance operations mean is conducting patrols through unpopulated desert areas, occasionally picking off 1 or 2 ISIS militants, and then proclaiming those clearance operations to have been a success. But all they're doing is just pushing ISIS into another corner where they continue to operate in the same way that they did before. And that, I think, is a big source of concern, because the longer that continues, the more likely ISIS will be able to, on a small level, continue to recruit, continue to degrade the security capabilities of the regime and its allies. And I fear also potentially expand those capabilities over the other side of the Euphrates River into the US and SDF controlled areas. And that's something that from a policy perspective, I think we all need to be very concerned about, is continuing to watch the regime's inability to deal with the ISIS resurgence and the inevitable impact that will have on our own ability and our own policy on the other side of the river.
On the other side of the river, Jomana, the U.S. retains a limited military presence on the ground focused on ISIS and kind of containing and deterring foreign actors like Russia and Iran. Despite the frequent changes in policy from the White House, what has the U.S. been able to achieve with that limited presence?
I mean, the argument is that with the limited presence, right, that it has been able to help stabilize that area in a delicate post-ISIS scenario. I believe the SDF forces are about 70,000 strong on the ground, more or less. And they are, currently right now keeping, for example, the ISIS prisoners, the issue that has yet to be resolved by the Europeans. So you have about 10 to 12,000 ISIS fighters that are being held by the SDF. Our forces, our resources have helped so far keep them detained. And you have, obviously, because of the U.S. presence right now, we have been able to keep Russia and Iran at bay. I think the question moving forward is, how long will Russia and Iran see our physical presence as sufficient deterrence from not attacking the Northeast? Will they attack despite U.S. presence there. They're keen on wrapping this up. We see that in the northwest and in other parts of Syria. Whether or not they've been able to maintain their control of it effectively is a different question. But they're keen on wrapping this up. And it's obviously, our presence has obviously been so far a thorn in the regime's side. The regime, obviously, one of the issues the Syrian government was proposing to the United States was removing its forces in exchange for the release of Austin Tice. So they obviously care about our physical presence there. Iran most definitely doesn't want us to be present. It has been a deterrent so far, but moving forward, how sustainable is this? And what else are we doing to extract anything from the regime, I think is key, or the regime and its allies, frankly, because we all know that the regime doesn't just represent itself, but the interest of its allies who have spent a lot of money and resources and manpower defending it.
Charles, Jomana just mentioned the issue of Austin Tice, and this week the Wall Street Journal broke the news that senior U.S. officials recently traveled to Damascus for hostage negotiation talks involving Austin Tice, among others, with Syria's spy chief, Ali Mamlouk. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has since come out with a statement saying that the U.S. will not change its stance on Syria to win the release of American detainees. What did you kind of make of that whole episode, and what were your kind of key takeaways from that?
I think first off, it's been an open secret that there has been outreach from the Trump White House, certainly in 2020, potentially earlier than that, specifically looking at this issue of US nationals being held as political detainees in Syria. So first of all, it's not a huge surprise. But having said that, this is the first confirmation we've had of senior US officials actually going to Damascus themselves, and not from the intelligence community, because, of course, I should add there has been reports in the past that CIA officials may have visited Damascus to negotiate this. But this is the first time where kind of political officials have been confirmed to have gone. And so I think it is a significant development, if not only merely the optics and the symbolism of US officials going to the capital of Syria to meet with Ali Mamlouk, who is designated by the US government, by the European Union, to negotiate with the Assad regime, who we've had a very, very clear position on from the get-go of sort of non-engagement and the fact that it has lost its legitimacy as a governor of the Syrian population. So I think merely from the optics standpoint, it's very significant. But I think Secretary Pompeo's comments yesterday are equally significant. I think they go to show, or at least to imply, that what we've seen and what has been reported is specifically a Trump White House policy, but not necessarily a US government policy of negotiating on this. And this is something, I picked up on with my own contacts in the State Department. I think it's quite clear that there are two very divergent tracks going on here. The Trump White House does appear to want to achieve some foreign policy wins in the run-up to the election. And of course, bringing American citizens home would represent a big win for the Trump White House. But at the same time, the State Department, which has worked very hard amidst some significant challenges posed by the Trump White House to sustain a more or less consistent policy of non-engagement with the regime, a pressure campaign through financial measures as well as military ones, I think is growing increasingly concerned that the Trump White House is taking measures into its own hands. And so I think Pompeo's insistence that our Syria policy will remain the same, and in a sense what he was saying is it wouldn't be betrayed by the negotiation for American citizens to come home. In other words, we want American citizens to come home, but that isn't a significant enough concession to just reverse our entire Syria policy. And I think that's both very significant, but also concerning, frankly, that the US government continues to be incapable of working hand in hand between the White House and the various arms of the government. Until we have an outcome of the upcoming election, I think that will continue and potentially escalate if this track is perhaps more substantive than has been reported until now. And there's some reason to believe that there is probably more to this story than has been reported so far.
Jomana, the other big issue that I wanted to touch on here on the U.S. policy front is the Caesar Act, which came into force in June. The so-called Summer of Caesar has now come and gone. In your view, how successful have those sanctions been? Have they lived up to your expectations?
Well, I think it's too early to speak, I think, definitively about the impact of the Caesar sanctions in particular. As you know, there's been like a series of rounds of sanctions under different laws, and not just limited to those that fall under the Caesar Act. I think it's important to remember that the Caesar Act, despite how it's sometimes portrayed, it was definitely a bipartisan effort by policymakers to try and squeeze leaders of the regime, members of the Assad regime, companies, institutions, Assad herself, other notable characters that have at least financed the regime from the Syrian side. Going back to what I said earlier, is that we know that the regime is not solely being financed or supported by just Syrians. I mean, the Caesar Act is intended to cover, Russian and Iranians, assets and individuals, etc. But I think it's too early to tell if the impact of these sanctions are achieving their desired objectives. Of course, you have humanitarian organizations that will tell you this has made their lives harder. It made it more complicated to deliver or to send, certain medical equipment, for example, dual use items, etc. I honestly think it's too early to tell whether or not these will have the lasting impact that we want it to have. Now, I think it's also important to remember, and I'm not pleased about saying this, but the regime hasn't budged as a result of these sanctions. We know it's suffering economically. We know prices in Damascus and government-controlled Syria have skyrocketed. We know jobs are few and far in between due to Corona, due to economic sanctions. I mean, there's a series of reasons why Syria is where it is today. And I always like to underline that it's not the American imposed Caesar sanctions that have brought Syria to its knees. It's a series of things, most importantly of which is that the Assad regime itself contributed to the massive brain drain of its professionals. It destroyed its own infrastructure, its own buildings, its own hospitals, its own institutions in order to win this war. I think it's important. Listen, I think that there's a huge debate around international sanctions right now. And I think in the case of Syria, I see no incentive on removing them as of yet and getting nothing in return. And I say this as someone who is of Syrian origin. It's not, all of the people that I know that have worked on this, I don't think punishment of the population en masse is the objective. But I do think that the regime would love nothing more than to be able to have its characters, its high net worth individuals be able to travel with ease, to be able to invest with ease. And I think we should continue to make it as difficult as possible for the regime to do that. And just going back briefly, this was the objective even with the Northeast, depriving the Syrian regime of the most important assets in Syria was a big part of the reason why the U.S. presence was in Northeast Syria, let's say, as opposed to other areas, in addition to the fact that obviously the SDF fighting force is there. But that is part of, the breadbasket of Syria is there, the critical oil and gas. All of this is present in Northeast Syria. And so, the idea is to find ways to get resources into Syria or benefiting the Syrian people while giving the regime as little access to it. But I do think sanctions are tricky, and I'm not a sanctions expert by any means. I think it's very tricky, and it would be wrong to say that there's never going to be a trickling effect on civilians. That would be inaccurate.
Charles, do you have anything you want to add here?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and sort of reiterate some of the things that Jomana said, or add to them. I think she made a number of very important points. I mean, first of all, I do think we need more time to play out before we can take a reading on whether or not sanctions are having any kind of a political or diplomatic effect. Clearly, those things take time. But I think also it's worth sort of underlining that sanctions aren't a magic solution, and they don't operate alone, or they shouldn't operate alone. I do think under this administration, diplomacy has been sharply lacking, and that reduces the likelihood that sanctions will contribute towards the desired diplomatic effect of forcing or coercing the regime to change its calculations. But, having said that, I think Jomana's point that sanctions aren't the cause of Syria's financial crisis is crucially important, not just for making that point alone, but also because the prospect of removing sanctions isn't going to solve Syria's financial crisis either. And I think that's the crux of the issue here, is that the underlying causes of the crisis altogether, but including the financial crisis, is the regime, is its continued corruption, is its brutality towards the population today and over the last 9 years. And the fact that the Caesar Act has become this big kind of the number one calling card by Russia and the regime in particular in the United Nations and in all of their public statements on Syria diplomacy underlines all by itself that sanctions can be and are a source of US leverage. They don't have to be sanctions forever. Sanctions can be both a carrot and a stick through the prospect of having them lifted in return for concessions. And I think that's where, A, we need diplomacy, but B, where it's important to bear in mind that sanctions are only one non-military component of what should be a much broader and more holistic strategy, albeit one that appears to be lacking today, but that doesn't remove their sort of viability or potential value.
If I could just talk briefly about the United Nations, because I think that's one, an issue that has come up. It comes up every year for the past several years, and it will come up next year. And I think the vote at the Security Council next July will be an absolutely critical one. And how the United States prepares for that scenario is even more crucial. As you know, this past July, the Russians and the Chinese vetoed all but the last border crossing going into Syria. And this was basically the only way to allow UN aid into northwestern Syria that would otherwise be cut off to UN agencies that provide critical support for the 4 million people in Idlib, as I've told you. Now, the Russians and the Chinese already vetoed the last round, and Yarubia crossing was impacted in the northeast. We saw firsthand what happens when these crucial UN border crossings are closed. The northeast was struggling to prepare its COVID response, and it was really at the mercy of Damascus, because what happens is when these border crossings are closed, then the UN must work through its Damascus office. And we all know that the UN office has been used by Damascus, the Russians, to direct aid as it sees fit. And so therefore it has become politicized in its distribution of aid, where it can't go, where it can evaluate, where it can monitor, what is considered a priority in terms of rehabilitation, repairing water systems, electricity, etc. And I think next year it will be very important to watch for that, because the Russians are worried about not having European and American sanctions removed. And if that's the case, and they don't get, the aid they're anticipating, they don't get the green light for the reconstruction funds that they need to rehabilitate even, the part of Syria where the government is most prominent. They are trying to do this by expanding the budgets and the mandates of current UN programs, UNDP, etc. I mean, we're already hearing about this through individuals at the UN that are watching this very carefully and finding that Russia and China are finding runarounds to get the money they need to achieve the political objectives that they have. And I think this is something that should be of concern to us as Americans, because we are, I believe, the largest funder to the UN in Syria. If not, we're either first or second. I'm not sure if it's us or the Europeans, but regardless, that is our taxpayer funding. And, depriving the Syrian regime with money through the Caesar sanctions on the one hand, but giving them that money through other means, and not putting any conditions on it or sufficient conditions on it, I think would be absolutely contradictory to our objective and just counterproductive.
Charles, turning to the upcoming U.S. election, we're less than 2 weeks out now from November 3rd. When it comes to U.S. policy on Syria, what do you see as the most kind of salient potential differences between a Trump and a Biden White House?
I think the Trump administration has embraced a kind of all-out maximum pressure strategy, very much alike what they have with Iran, but with no clear door out, whether for the Syrian regime or for Russia as its sort of primary diplomatic protector. There's no clear path out of this maximum pressure strategy. Our demands have remained extremely maximalist. given what's happened over the last 9 years and given the Syrian regime's position of relative advantage today compared to where it was several years ago. I think a Biden administration would be much more likely, first of all, to introduce diplomacy as the priority, which is kind of urgently needed at this point. And I do think the US has meaningful areas of leverage to make that diplomacy potentially meaningful and constructive. I think a Biden administration would also work much harder to sort of rebuild the kind of coalition, the diplomatic coalition that we had under the Obama administration, albeit with very different situations on the ground. The Trump administration continues to be, as we've seen in the context of these reports about negotiations over US citizens being held, very unpredictable in terms of its assessment and priorities vis-a-vis Syria policy. As I said earlier, the Trump White House appears to prioritize sort of immediate tactical victories in Syria over and above the broader, more holistic strategic picture. I don't think we would see that under a Biden administration, who I think have learned a lot of lessons in terms of mistakes made under Obama's presidency, of perhaps not sufficiently taking into account the Syrian regime's utter refusal to negotiate. But as I say, the situation in those years was very different to what it is today. I happen to think that the financial crisis and the financial ruin of Syria arguably represents more of an opportunity for us to negotiate probably directly with the Russians first than any situation that then Secretary of State John Kerry faced in early years in 2014, 15 and 16. But I think those are probably the key differences for now.
Jomana, building off what Charles just said and kind of looking ahead to next January, what are the key policy changes you'd like to see the next administration make?
Well, serving on the Constitutional Committee, I think one thing that was always glaring to me continues to be, I think, a major gap, is that the United States is not really active in that process. I mean, it's very much a Russia-led game. And part of it is definitely by design, right? I understand that the United States and its allies, although this is the one consensus issue that all of the countries involved in Syria were able to agree on from UN Security Council 2254, I think there was always deep skepticism about this being the first step for absolutely good reason. There are glaring issues in the Syrian constitution, but the Syrian constitution is not why the Syrian people went out in the streets. In fact, in the beginning, there were calls for reform, not complete revolution. And so these are, partially by design. There hasn't been the kind of investment by the United States and its allies to shape that process in the way that they think would produce the outcomes, for transition or otherwise. But I think more aggressive diplomacy is it's always good to push forward on. I think that that's one thing that we know, that both parties are actually, keen to use, more non-military tools. To what extent, of course, they differ, but you have to have some things. You have to have some leverage. I'm trying to be optimistic, but 10 years in, it's really hard to aggressively show up when the Russians and the Iranians and the regime have invested so much capital in taking back the majority of Syria back, frankly. I still think that there are some, measures of cooperation we can take to prevent humanitarian complete collapse in Idlib. I think it's necessary. If you were talking about 10,000 people, you could argue that they can be somehow integrated into like a neighboring country, but you're talking about 4 million people, none of whom any of the neighboring countries want in their countries because of their own domestic calculations, and would be, their lives would be directly at stake if they were to go back into regime-held areas, because the people in Idlib are the culmination of all the revolutionaries and the rebels that were taken and bussed in green buses from all other parts of Syria. I don't think the solution will be an easy one. And the same you have with the Northeast is that, even the United States, I think aggressive diplomacy on helping the Northeast find stability is is necessary. I mean, they have intra-Kurdish issues. I know the current administration is working on resolving this. I don't know if they can resolve it before, let's say, a new administration were to come into power. But the relationship between the SDF and the Turks, the intra-Kurdish issues, and then you have the Kurdish-Arab issues. And those things also need to be sorted out with aggressive diplomacy. And, these are areas where I think, the U.S. Can possibly play a role, at least in working with others, like Charles said, working more closely with allies on achieving some of those objectives.
We're running short on time, but before we wrap up, Charles, any final thoughts?
I think just within the context of the US election coming up, I think it's important, just to maintain some of these truths about Syria. I think as Jomana has said, it's very difficult to be optimistic about the situation. That's for sure. But I think we have to remember that the crisis isn't over. It isn't over. And that the number one rule from a US or Western policy perspective over the last nearly decade is that what happens in Syria does not stay in Syria. And the idea that we can sort of wish away the situation, wash our hands of it, and not be affected by the inevitable instability that will continue to emanate from Syria is extremely dangerous. This is a situation we have to deal with. And we're much more capable of dealing with it if we're trying to take a lead than if we sort of resign and surrender it to other more malign actors who frankly don't have our best interests in mind. And within the domestic US political context, it's also important to remember that, yes, the US needs to, quote unquote, end its forever wars, but Syria isn't a forever war. Syria is a qualitatively different case. When people talk about the war on terror having cost $6.4 trillion, they are right to criticize large aspects of that policy. But the intervention against ISIS in Syria has cost a minute sum of money in comparison. Our military mission against ISIS has, by and large, been a success over the last several years, whereas, of course, Iraq and Afghanistan and other interventions and Libya have been failures. Our military footprint is minuscule compared to the forces that we've used and deployed elsewhere. And as I say, they have achieved success, not failure. Our losses, our spending are considerably smaller in comparison to the success, again, that we have managed to achieve. Of course, the broader policy, the broader diplomatic challenge remains. And I'm certainly not saying that there is an easy solution to that. But given all of the costs that we have seen play out over the last several years, surely it makes sense to re-energize diplomacy and give a diplomatic settlement a go, rather than simply giving up and washing our hands of a situation that I think when all of us, whether skeptics or not, sit down in a quiet, honest moment, we all know that Syria is not going to magically stabilize just because the US leaves. If anything, and I'm fairly convinced of this, it will get worse. And so it is our responsibility as part of the international community to play a role, and potentially a leading role, in helping to resolve the situation as best as we can, given all of the limitations that I think we all need to accept.
I fully agree with you, Charles. I think especially the point where you said that what happens in Syria doesn't stay in Syria. And I think, I'm under no illusions that Syria in and of itself is a U.S. national security priority. It is, frankly, has been a subcategory to our Iran policy, to our counterterrorism policy, to a variety of other things, but it has not been a priority in and of itself. And I think the results have shown that it has not been. I try to look at this from a strictly national security lens, and I also, I can't help but also look at it from sort of the humanitarian and human rights costs that we have also seen. It saddens me to see the way resolving the Syria crisis has played out in the United Nations, and how, an institution that we helped create has been co-opted, by the Russians, by Chinese, by nefarious actors, frankly, at the expense of Syria and Syrians. And they've been able to, brilliantly achieve their objectives, and part of that time through our taxpayer dollars, because it's, we're still operating, we're trying to operate within traditional rules. And unfortunately, our adversaries do not I agree with Charles that even if the United States decides to extract itself from this, that will not. I mean, the Syrian. I think the Syrian conflict can only get worse. We've seen every time we think it can't get worse, it actually does. And I do not think that the Syrian regime can ever hold Syria in the way it did again, even with the assistance of its allies. I don't think it will be that, closed off black hole that the regime had, the kind of control that the regime had over Syrians prior to 2011. And I think we've seen several instances of protests happen in Daraa, in Sweda, in other areas. I mean, even in the Northeast. Try as they might, the Kurds have attempted to negotiate with Damascus, and Damascus has been unbudging, even on some of the most minimal concessions that the Kurds have asked for. And so I do think that there can and should be more done on the diplomatic front. I hope that our humanitarian aid continues to the areas that are at least most unstable, to the most vulnerable communities. I do hope that we cooperate and collaborate more with other countries who also, have suffered sort of a direct result of, the Europeans have been dealing with the refugee aftermath for years now, because the root of the conflict has not been resolved. And I think we will continue to see trickling effects of this conflict in a variety of different ways. And so I think we have at least some incentive to remain engaged. And there are a variety of different ways to do that. And I do hope that whoever assumes office next, and particularly if it's a Biden administration, that it remains on the agenda, that Syria remains on the agenda, because it will not be solved on its own.
We'll have to leave things there for now. But Charles, Jomana, thank you both for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in, and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.